In dynamic thermometer levels, there are two types of loading zones. First, there's the loading zone around the player. Second, there's the loading zones created by the objects and logic in the level. Dynamic thermometer levels work by following this simple rule. When the player's loading zone intersects with the loading zone of an object, the object gets loaded in. It's important to know when and how loading zones get created and what determines their shape and size. Let's show you how the shapes and sizes of object loading zones are determined and how this affects your dynamic thermometer. Every object in your level has its own invisible loading zone in the shape of a rectangular box around it. When you connect multiple objects together by gluing, they will be considered one object and share a loading zone in the form of a square box around all the glued objects. A similar thing happens when you connect two objects together using a connector or a logic wire. Sensors that have a radius also affect the size and shape of the loading zone they belong to. The loading zone will be a rectangle around the maximum radius. Additionally, you can create your own loading zone around multiple objects by using the Loading Linker tool. Simply select the loading linker from the dynamic thermometer section of the tools bag and tap the action button on multiple objects to group them together in a loading zone. When you are finished selecting the objects, press the cancel button to create your new loading zone. If you want an object to be permanently loaded in, you can use the Permanency Tweaker tool. To use the Permanency Tweaker, grab one from the dynamic thermometer section of your tools bag and place it on an object. That object and all objects in the same loading zone will now always be loaded in. The dynamic thermometer gives you lots of extra room in your level. Unfortunately, it doesn't give you infinite thermometer. To ensure your level runs smoothly, it is very important that you do not have lots and lots of things being loaded at once. The best way to do this is to carefully manage your loading zones. We'll go over some tips and tricks to help you manage your loading zones, allowing you to increase performance on your dynamic thermometer levels. As a general rule, you want your loading zones to be as compact as possible. There are a couple of things you can do to achieve this. When creating in a dynamic thermometer level, you will want to avoid gluing things as much as possible. Larger objects like floors and platforms are especially best left unglued. They can often create large loading zones and cause unnecessary stuff to stream in. Instead, make objects either static or use the anti-gravity tweaker to keep things in place. Another thing you want to pay special attention to when creating a dynamic thermometer level is the radii of your sensors. As the radius of a sensor gets larger, so does its loading zone. In dynamic thermometer levels, you should always try to shrink down the radius of your sensor as much as possible. Additionally, you can also tweak the trigger angle range to shrink down the loading zone even further. One of the biggest troublemakers in dynamic thermometer levels are long logic wires. Remember, connecting two objects or logic pieces with a wire will put them in the same loading zone. If the objects are far apart from each other, this loading zone will be very large and cause many things to load in when it's not needed. Here, the button on the bottom left of our level is connected with a wire to a teleporter on the top right of our level. Because the resulting loading zone has the shape of a large rectangle around all the objects in the zone, the loading zone will include the area in the center. This means that when the player is in the center, both the bottom left and top right area of the level will get loaded into our streaming zone. As Sackboy is nowhere near these areas, loading these parts of the level while Sackboy is in the center is a waste of resources. This can possibly affect the performance of the level. It's best to prevent this kind of setup whenever possible, so we will delete the wire causing the issue. As you can see, unplugging the wire removed a large loading zone and left us with 3 nice compact zones. So how do we get this signal from the button to the teleporter without creating a huge loading zone? Remember, using a normal tag sensor to transmit the signal wirelessly would create a very large radius, which also creates a large loading zone. This is why we will use the remote tag sensor. Because this sensor does not have a radius, it does not create a loading zone in the same way as a normal sensor would. First, plug the button into a tag. Then grab a remote tag sensor from the sensors section of the tools bag and hook it up to the teleporter. Now comes the tricky part. If we press the button, nothing happens. This is because the remote tag sensor is not loaded in while we are in this section of the level. The solution here is to use a preloader to make sure that the remote tag sensor is loaded in when we are about to press the button. Grab a preloader from your tools bag and place it near the button. Now, open its tweak menu. Select Place Zone and move the box over to the teleporter area. Set it to full load and tweak the maximum detection range so it covers the button. You also want to make sure it has a correct layer range. By doing this, the destination area and remote tag sensor load in your level whenever a player is close to the button. This makes the area ready for someone to teleport to. As you can see, the teleporter works again. Plus, we still have our 3 separate loading zones.